All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Have you ever wondered why a simple sit down can sound totally fine in one situation, but just incredibly rude in another? Today, we're taking a deep dive into Tema 18, the art of directives. And look, this isn't just your standard grammar review. Think of it more as a masterclass in the actual mechanics of human interaction. We're going to explore everything from the structural bones of an imperative sentence all the way up to the high level pragmatic competence you need to navigate really complex social hierarchies. So here's our syllabus for today. We'll be covering the anatomy of directives, first and third person usage, the scale of directive force, the rules of prohibition, how we go about reporting directives, and finally, context and digital evolution. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The anatomy of directives. We're starting our lab work by looking at how sentences are categorized by their communicative function.
Now, a directive isn't just a bossy command, right? From a pragmatic perspective, it's literally any utterance designed to get a hearer to behave in a specific way. While a statement just gives you information and a question asks for it, a directive is inherently hearer-oriented. Its whole purpose is to influence a future action. And because of that, the category of directives is incredibly broad. I mean, it ranges from a short, formulaic shout, like quiet, all the way to a super complex indirect request wrapped in layers of politeness. But underneath all of that, the structural engine driving the whole thing is usually the imperative sentence.
It's fascinating how the formal clause patterns of imperatives mirror our standard statements, even though they heavily restrict tense, aspect, and modality by just sticking to the base form of the verb. You've got your standard subject-verb pattern with jump, subject-verb complement with be reasonable, and subject-verb-object adverbial with put it on the table. But here's the real academic catch, that imperative verb is severely restricted. You won't find tense distinctions or perfect aspects here simply because, well, you can't command someone to have already done something in the past. Makes sense, right? You also generally won't see modal auxiliaries or stative, non-agentive verbs. After all, you can't logically command a state. You can't tell your stereo to sound louder. Now, what's actually super interesting here is the difference in stress and tone units when we introduce a subject. Normally, commands lack an overt subject because the you is just naturally implied. But retaining the subject you creates this finger-wagging admonition. It expresses irritation, like, you, be quiet. Contrast that with using a vocative, like Mary. A vocative requires its own separate tone unit and can dynamically move around the sentence. You can say, Mary, play on my side, or play on my side, Mary. That vocative singles someone out, but completely drops the inherent irritation of the admonitory subject. Moving right along to Section 2, first and third person directives. Let's see how directives extend way beyond just the second person you. So by using the objective case pronoun right after the word let, we can construct these really collaborative suggestions, or even formal third person edicts. For example, we have the first person singular, let me have a look, and the incredibly common first-person plural suggestion, let's all work hard. We can even step into an elevated, kind of archaic register with a third-person directive like, let each man decide for himself. But pay close attention to this grammatical exception. A second-person construction with this format, like, let you have a look, remains strictly ungrammatical in standard English. The linguistic architecture just doesn't support it. All right, Section 3, the scale of directive force. This is where our explainer shifts gears from pure syntax into the semantics of human interaction. So the absolutely crucial point here is that high-level linguistics relies on J.R. Searle's concept of illocutionary acts to understand how much power a directive actually wields. When we speak, we are performing an action. The illocutionary force is basically the intended effect of that action. And that force, it isn't static. It fluctuates wildly based on three things: who has the authority, who gets the benefit of the action, and what the specific situational context is. I mean, think about it. Telling someone to take a seat has a wildly different illocutionary force if it comes from your best friend versus, say, a judge in a courtroom. Think of this as a sliding scale of authority. We start at the absolute strongest end with rigid, forceful commands, like an officer yelling, "Fire!" As we step down the scale, the force softens up a bit. We move into please, where the speaker desperately needs the hearer's action, like shouting, "Help!" Then we step into requests, which are essentially tactful commands that ask if the hearer is willing or able to comply. Think of asking, "Can you pass the salt?" And finally, we arrive at advice and suggestions, which technically leave the final decision up to the hearer, using modals like "you should." When we analyze tact and face-saving on this scale, we've got to explicitly credit Brown and Levinson. Their foundational work on politeness theories showed us that the more polite we want to be, the more tentative and indirect our language actually becomes. If we want to avoid causing offense, what they call saving face, we can't just bark base verb imperatives at people. We have to wrap our directives in linguistic padding. We transform a blunt, give me that, into a much more tactful, would you mind giving me that? You can literally manipulate the force of your directives using a few very specific tools. For instance, a rising intonation can instantly soften a harsh command into something much more palatable. Adding polite markers like please or a tag question like won't you turns a strict directive into a negotiation. For highly formal settings, we embed courtesy subjuncts asking someone to kindly do something. And honestly, my personal favorite is the persuasive imperative. By simply adding the auxiliary do right before the verb, like do have some more sherry, you create an insistent yet incredibly hospitable and polite tone.
Okay, Section 4, the rules of prohibition. Now we pivot from exhortation to the grammatical imposition of an obligation not to act.
So how do we scientifically tell someone not to do something? Well, whether you're using a basic don't or employing inherently negative verbs that allow the following clause to remain positive, the English language offers a pretty diverse toolkit for saying no. Basic negation is straightforward. Don't hurry. But when we bring in modal verbs like mustn't or may not, we enter the realm of strict authoritative prohibition. If we want to soften that into negative advice, we step down to shouldn't or had better not. And brilliantly, we can also use inherently negative verbs like forbid or prohibit. These structurally prohibit an action while keeping the rest of the sentence syntactically positive, as in, they were forbidden to smoke.
Moving to Section 5, reporting directives in speech. Let's look at what happens structurally when we need to report a command that someone else gave.
This requires a really fascinating shift from direct to indirect speech. Ask yourself why these differ. Standard reporting uses a to infinitive, but verbs reflecting suggestions or recommendations require a complex that clause, often paired with the putative should. It comes down to this. When the original illocutionary force is strong, like an order or a plea, we simply use the to infinitive, like saying he ordered them to put on their spacesuits. But if the original force was just a delicate suggestion, the whole grammar shifts. Verbs like suggest or recommend trigger a that clause, bringing in that putative should to perfectly capture the tentative nature of the original utterance.
Finally, Section 6, Context and Digital Evolution. For our final academic module, we're examining pragmatics in the real world.
Because, let's be real, a structurally perfect sentence is completely useless if it's deployed in the wrong environment. At the highest levels of language mastery, just understanding the grammar isn't enough. You must possess the pragmatic competence to match your directive perfectly to your social environment. This is exactly what's required for advanced C2 level English proficiency. It's the ability to intuitively gauge the exact weight of your words, adjusting your register and tact dynamically so that your illocutionary force achieves your goal, without violating any social norms.
For example, a bare imperative works perfectly in a military setting or a low-context culture, but using it in a high-context workplace could completely destroy your professional collegiality. In military or legal contexts, direct commands or the modal shall are preferred for their absolute precision. But in the workplace, we use highly polite, indirect forms to maintain smooth working relationships. Furthermore, cross-cultural awareness is key here. Low-context cultures, like the US or Germany, often really value directness. High-context cultures, such as Japan or China, rely heavily on indirectness to save face and preserve group harmony. Pragmatic competence means knowing exactly which of these environments you're standing in at any given moment. And then there's the internet. According to David Crystal's foundational work on internet linguistics, our transition into the digital age has drastically warped how we deploy commands. We are interacting through screens, which completely strips away tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language. This creates a massive communicative void that we have to fill purely with our syntax and semantic choices. And this brilliantly illustrates the bizarre dual reality of modern communication. We completely overcompensate with polite markers in emails because we lack those nonverbal cues. We write things like, I was wondering if you might possibly have time to, just to avoid sounding demanding in text. Yet, think about how we treat our digital assistants. We bark bare, immediate, blunt imperatives at them without a second thought. Siri, set a timer. Alexa, turn off the lights. We shift from ultra-polite indirectness with humans to absolute military-style directness with machines, all within the exact same digital ecosystem. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to look at your next text message or email and ask yourself, what is the true illocutory force of the words I'm using? How are you actively balancing authority, politeness, and indirectness?
Remember, every single time you tell someone to do something, whether it's a desperate plea for help, a tentative suggestion, or a bare imperative shouted at your phone, you are performing a complex split-second calculation of syntax and social pragmatics. Pay attention to your directives, because the way you command the world around you speaks volumes about how you see your place within it. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.